Welcome, welcome. It has been a while. We missed you during our August hiatus, and we are so thrilled to be back in this Lunch and Learn space together. Thank you for joining us today. Our first Lunch and Learn of the new school year is Building the Green Economy: Why the Fights Against Climate Change and Runaway Inequality Need a Strong Labor Movement. You've probably heard a lot of talk about all of the various crises that we are facing as a society at the same time. Today, we're going to focus on the climate crisis and the crisis of rising economic inequality, and explore some of the solutions that really rise to the speed and scope and scale of these challenges, and the way that organized workers and the labor movement can be central to advancing those solutions. We are delighted to have Francis Eanes with us today. Francis leads the Maine Labor Climate Council, which is a new organization formed by a coalition of unions to advance an ambitious pro-worker agenda to combat climate change and reverse economic inequality. Francis, thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for our time together today. We will hear from Francis first and then tackle all of your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You do not need to wait, though. You can send those questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I'll keep track and I'll be the one to ask those of Francis in the Q&A. Please don't message him directly. We want him to be able to focus on the presentation, not the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded, and you'll get an email later this afternoon with a link to the recording, as well as follow-up information and ways to take our conversation together even further. Thank you for joining us. And Francis, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I really appreciate that. Wonderful to be with you all today. I am excited to share a little bit of the exciting happenings here in the Maine labor movement and ways in which we see this advancing shared interests of a lot of folks on this call. So if you give me a moment, I'm going to share my screen. And everyone see that okay? Awesome. So as Kathleen said, my name is Francis Eanes. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Labor Climate Council. We are a coalition of about 20 labor unions here in Maine who are coming together to simultaneously address the climate crisis and address runaway inequality and put workers really at the center of both. So with that, I want to frame this whole talk with a couple of titles and headlines that will be doubtlessly familiar to all of you. We can't go another day or week, it seems, without seeing headlines like this: dire warnings about the consequences of inaction, climate change worse than expected, UN report finds, or we need to do all we can, 5 takeaways from the UN climate report. A hotter future is certain, right? And on, right? It seems like every week we get news about the Ross ice sheet melting faster than we thought, right? We're seeing more extreme weather here in Maine, whether it's extreme temperatures, more intense windstorms in the fall, nor'easters, you name it, right? And we here in Maine are in better position, perhaps, than the rest of the country, but still, the climate crisis is real. It is happening now, and there are so many reasons why we as a society need to take this seriously. At the same time, and to not diminish the urgency of the climate crisis, we are also living through perhaps the height of a new gilded age, peak pinnacle of inequality, right? And headlines like this probably have not escaped you either in the last couple of years, right? During the pandemic, Titles like billionaires saw their wealth grow by 62% during the pandemic, while workers' wages grew by 10%. Or a new billionaire has been minted nearly every day during the pandemic. Or super yacht market surges as wealthy seek luxury and seclusion. And I kid you not, if there is a shortage of parts to build luxury yachts, like, you know, we are living in a moment marked by deep and growing inequality. To put those headlines into graph form, this will doubtlessly be familiar to all of you. We could sum up the climate crisis, and I don't like to do it this often, but this is just to bring this home. Global atmospheric concentrations in parts per million from 1900 to 2018, right? The familiar graph of emissions going up and up. If you zoom out over time, it's the famous hockey stick graph, right? You all have seen this. This might be where a lot of you hang your hat in the climate world. I want to sum up the inequality crisis with a similar type of graph. And what this is showing here is, in the US from 1918 to 2008, the share of US income going to the wealthiest 10%. And we could look at wealth and the differences in the ways in which wealth is amplifying inequality. But what do we see here, right? We see peak inequality in the 20s, the roaring 20s, inequality falling in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then a steady creep upward for the last 50 years. And certainly if we fast forwarded from 2008 to today, that chart only goes up. But there's another part of this story, and where I see the climate crisis, and so many others too, on this call even, the climate crisis coming together with this crisis of inequality, is explained by this bottom curve. And this is the share of workers in the US labor force who are union members. And what's striking to me, and you can find versions of this chart in many different academic publications, is that the single greatest explanatory factor of why inequality goes up and down is the density of union members, the number, right, the proportion of our workforce who is a member of a labor union, right? And as density goes up of union membership, inequality comes down. And as union membership declines, inequality grows. It really is that simple. There's a lot of factors that explain union density. I don't mean to oversimplify that. But if there's nothing else you take away, it's that a strong labor movement means we have less inequality. And what I want to do today is build on that proposition and say, not only does a strong labor movement mean less inequality, and that's good for all number of reasons, but this is also essential for the fight against climate change. We can do both. These both can and should, and I would argue must, run through the labor movement. So first, I want to give you 5 reasons for why this is the case. Economic growth and emissions, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, are deeply interlinked. This is looking at the billions of tons of carbon dioxide emitted per year globally from 1900 to 2020. And what you see, right, is of course this familiar rising curve of emissions. And each time there's a vertical dotted line, we see an economic recession, right? Whether it's the Spanish flu, Great Depression, the ends of World War II, right? Oil shocks of the 70s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the financial crisis and recession of 2008. And what do we see here? Every time there's a recession, we see a dip in emissions, right? Emissions and economic growth are deeply linked. And this is a problem if you're a working person, working families, working communities, because if the plan is to seriously address the climate crisis and bring emissions down at the scale and scope that all the available science says we must, we need to find a way to break this link between economic growth. Because if our only plan to bring emissions down is to put a whole bunch of people out of work, that's not a great solution. So we got to take that into perspective. That's a starting point, but it's not the only reason. The second reason why the climate crisis and addressing the climate crisis needs a strong labor movement is that unionized workers have deep expertise that is essential for building the scale and scope of new energy systems. This probably will not escape any of you who have driven up and down I-95 anytime in the last year or since 2019, when Maine's law has really opened the door to solar, utility scale solar in particular, or net energy billing. But this is true in so many other parts of the world that many of you live in on a day-to-day basis. And that is that we are 10, 20 years into an accelerating process to rebuild our entire energy infrastructure and our entire energy system. And there's good reasons for this. There are a lot of forces driving this, including public policy, including private capital. But the take-home message is this: these are complex energy systems. If we're looking at an energy transition akin to the Industrial Revolution, I want to know who's actually building these energy systems, right? And when we have solar fields getting built, in some cases, hundreds of acres, right? More than 100 megawatts for some of our larger, newer solar farms. These are deceptively, if you look at them, they look like they're simple projects, but they're not. We're talking about high voltage projects. You got to know what you're doing. And we want, and I hope you all want, and I believe you will want, the most highly trained, competent workforce, ready, willing, and able to take these projects on. And that is in the best interest of society in addressing climate change at the speed, scale, and scope that we need to have this work done as effectively, as safely, as efficiently as possible. And who's the workforce that can get that done? I would argue it's workers who have come through registered apprenticeships, right? Who have gotten that next level of deep training to do this work incredibly well. This is true as well as we look into novel energy systems. And whatever your position is on offshore wind, this industry, as it gets off the ground, is highly, highly, highly complex, right? We're talking about towers that are hundreds of feet tall, larger than even onshore wind, right? Blades that weigh dozens of tons, right? We're talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds of heavy equipment when we're the cranes that need to move them, the ships that need to move them, working in high tides, really rough offshore conditions, really rough onshore in port conditions potentially, right? This is novel construction. This needs to go well. And it is absolutely essential that we have the best trained craftspeople to do this work. Again, it's incumbent on everyone, whatever your position, to make sure this goes well. We can't afford to have slip-ups. We can't afford to have accidents. We do not want any additional adverse impacts from any sort of energy system. And this is true for any other workers affected by a transition to, for example, offshore wind, including our brothers and sisters in fisheries. We need them at the table too, to help understand how coexistence can be possible and how this industry can get off the ground in a win-win scenario. Workers need to be at the center no matter where they sit in this pipeline. This is true as we think about not just energy generation, but how we need to electrify so many of the other systems, including transportation, that we know we need to. This is a picture of a ribbon cutting with the governor, Senator King, and others this March down in Portland. The greater metro Portland got 4 electric buses from Proterra, by the way, a union company. And this is really exciting. We're seeing this happen with school buses across the country, including here in Maine. We're seeing cities like Bangor make commitments to electrify their bus fleet. That is great. There's all kinds of reasons why we should be excited and supportive of that. And yet, when it comes to the day-to-day operation of what these buses look like, I want my union brother from Amalgamated Transit Union, Mike Frager, Metro bus operator, right, vice president of his union, I want to hear from workers like him who actually have to drive these buses and make sure they work in hot summers when we're running the air conditioner and in cold, icy, snowy Maine roads. We need to make sure that workers who are actually running this equipment are at the center of making sure this transition to electrification happens. And that's with no shade to the policymakers on this screen. We got to put workers at the center. The same is true, and this might be a little more outside the realm of what we think about with the climate crisis, but all of the buildings that we know we need to do deep retrofits on to electrify wherever possible, bring alternative forms of energy to as well. This is an example of the library, the state archives here in Maine. And I have this picture up here because it was unionized workers, state workers, through the Maine Service Employees Association, who raised the alarm bell about asbestos, black mold, and other kinds of unsafe working conditions through their union, brought legislation that was passed a couple of years ago through the legislature to do a full inventory and tracking of our publicly owned building stock, right? And we have a lot of work to do to actually implement the good recommendations that came out of that legislation. But the point is that when workers are empowered through their job, through their union, to call attention to changes that need to be made in their work site, I can tell you this, it's more likely to be heard. We're more likely to get the resources deployed at the scale and speed that we need than if we leave it to chance. And we know, and I think this will come as no surprise to anyone, when we replace the HVAC system in a building like the State Museum Archives, when we do the kind of building envelope work to really make that a tight, energy efficient building, right, that addresses the black mold and asbestos issues, that's also really good for energy efficiency, and that's good for the climate. There are a lot of win-wins out there like that, and it is an untapped potential to have our union brothers and sisters in the public sector, no matter where they are, municipal, state, schools, leading the way. I want to mention a couple other things about why it is so important as we think about putting workers at the center of this transition, especially as we look at the building and construction trades, the workers themselves who are actually going to be building these new energy systems, retrofitting existing systems. It's not just enough to look at the jobs that exist. There are so many jobs that don't yet exist for this energy system that we're building. And who is in the best position to train the next generation of workers who are going to take those jobs, again, that in some cases do not yet exist? Well, the evidence is clear. If we look at the last 14 years of data nationally, the contribution from the unionized workforce and unions themselves to training workers through registered apprenticeship and getting them ready, getting them skilled up with, to be the next generation of craft people to do this work is coming 2 to 1 from unions, right? Unions have for years, for generations, invested heavily in their registered apprenticeship programs to really train that workforce to get them ready. The third reason why the climate crisis needs a strong labor movement is that workers have unique leverage in our economic system. As long as the wage system has existed, workers have had leverage and will continue to have leverage. And that matters. And we can see this historically. Let me just hide my screen. There we go. I'm going to walk you through a super quick tour of history. So what are the greatest hits of where the labor movement has been on the leading edge of social change? And just down the road in Lowell, Massachusetts, in the 1830s and 1840s, a series of strikes by teenage girls, led primarily by teenage girls, struck for not only better wages, but also a 10-hour workday, right? In some cases, they were up against typically a 14 or in some cases 16-hour workday, 6 or 7 days a week, right? And what we saw coming out of that as they win new 10-hour workdays is that this raises standards and sets the bar for all other workers in the vicinity. Similar types of struggles throughout the rest of the 1860s and into the 1870s and all the way up until 1937, when we finally get the Fair Labor Standards Act, we see workers struggling for not only the 10-hour day, but then the 8-hour day. The reason why we have an 8-hour day is because of this decades of worker-led, union-led struggle. In 1912, again, down the road in Massachusetts, we have the famous Bread and Roses multi-ethnic strike, not only for wages and better wages, though that was important, but also for women's suffrage and against child labor. Things that we take for granted now or think about as separate social movements, the women's suffrage movements or the movement against child labor, these were led by workers and powered by workers. Maybe not exclusively, but workers acting collectively through their unions are at the leading front of all of these fights. 1936, 1937, the 44-day Flint, Michigan sit-down strike for the right to a union, the right to collective bargaining, the right to overtime, and eventually then FDR passes the Fair Labor Standards Act. All of this is catalyzed through this famous 44-day strike, right? It wasn't because policymakers woke up one day and decided they wanted to be good to working people. It's because working people acting collectively through their unions demanded it. The same is true for the civil rights movement. And while it is absolutely undeniable that the Black church, the organized Black church in particular in the South, was a central engine to the civil rights movement, we cannot for a moment dismiss the fact that famous pictures like this, the 1963 March in Washington, were not possible, except that the AFL-CIO, through famous brothers like A. Philip Randolph, organized not only busloads of people, but paid for the buses themselves to bring attendees from literally all across the country to Washington. And this is a particular example of what were countless years and decades of the labor movement led by Black brothers and sisters in particular, driving for equality, not only in the workplace, though that is really important, but also across society for broader civil rights. And there's a long, rich tradition of labor struggle for civil rights. And for those of you who may not know, that the March on Washington was actually called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And there we see A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, two of the central figures who helped, along with MLK, to pull this march off. And so as we think about where we are today, unions are still engaged in fights that go beyond the workplace. And as we think about climate change in particular, there is so much leverage on the table of our organized nurses, of our organized teachers, whether it's through AFT or the NEA, it doesn't matter, right? Workers have power when they come together and make collective demands on their employer, on their school system, on their municipality, on their state, right? And we see similar struggles among the United Auto Workers working together in alliance with postal workers unions to demand that the federal government put forward their resources to electrify the postal fleet and to build these electric vehicles with union labor. Can be done. We're seeing movement in this direction. But again, it's because workers are standing up together through the power of their union to ask for it. We saw as well in February 2020, perhaps what was the first climate strike, a group of janitors represented through SEIU Local 26 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, went on a one-day strike to win a contract in collaboration with young climate justice activists in the Twin Cities. And they won a new contract that not only gave them important bumps, well-deserved in wages and benefits, but also responded to the janitors' demand for less toxic cleaning chemicals and improved energy efficiency in the buildings they clean, right? This is untapped potential that I would argue the labor movement has not fully realized yet, and society at large has not fully realized yet, but it's there, and it's going to take a lot of work to realize it. I want to be super clear that although there is this potential out there, there are real conflicts. And we see, the jobs versus environment is real. It's not going away anytime soon. And it would be naive of me and of anyone to pretend otherwise. Perhaps the most famous example of jobs versus the environment was the timber wars of the 1980s and 1990s in the Pacific Northwest, especially Oregon, right, where we see the northern spotted owl and attempts to use the protection of the northern spotted owl through listing it as an endangered species as a proxy to protect old growth forest, right? And we see images like this, right? Save a logger, kill a spotted owl, right? Loggers are endangered species too. We see this kind of unfortunate, but also very understandable opposition, right, from organized workers. There has always been, and perhaps most clearly represented through Tony Mazzocchi, currents within the labor movement who are trying to break outside of this either or. Either we have a healthy environment for all of us to live in, or we have jobs that pay family and community sustaining wages and benefits. And I lift up Tony Mazzocchi to you because, he's an often overlooked hero of many in the labor movement and the environmental movement as well. And he comes along in the 1940s and 1950s and really emerges in the 60s and 70s as the vice president of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, right? Not the place that many of you on this call would assume there would be movement to try and break out of this logjam between jobs versus the environment. But I put him up here because, and there's so much I would encourage you all to read about this man and the movement that he helped lead within his union. But President Nixon himself, who signed the most landmark environmental legislation in the 1970s that many of you will be familiar with, right? Whether it's the Clean Air Act, right? The Superfund Act, Toxic Substances Control Act, right? Or OSHA, right? Occupational Safety and Health Administration, asbestos safety standards. All of these things were thanks to, and Nixon gave explicit credit to, Tony Mazzocchi, organized workers in his union, and community and environmental allies and other unions as well, right? And he coins this idea of the just transition. And the basic concept here, and there's many ways in which we need to actually start putting some meat on the bone and not just give rhetoric and lip service to just transition, but the just transition concept is that, look, we got to actually take care of workers in a meaningful, practical way. For every plant that gets retired, there needs to be wage and benefit replacement. There needs to be job retraining for workers who are able, right? And a bridge to retirement for those who aren't, right? And we can go beyond that. And I'd be happy in the Q&A to discuss like specific ways to do that, but he's really trying to bring forward this idea that we got to get out of this job versus environment dead end. But it's real, and I want to be really clear that these conflicts are not going away, and that it's through our unions, right, that we can actually navigate them most effectively. The fourth reason I want to leave you with is that without high quality union jobs in the renewable sector in particular, and a credible, as Tony Mizaki called it, a super fund for workers in affected communities, there is no just transition. And I used to live in Lewiston, and I now live in Auburn, but we don't have to look very far in the state of Maine, no matter where you live, to see evidence that the track record for economic transitions is pretty poor. What you see here is Bates Mill number 5, one of 8 mills that were the beating heart of textile and industry in the state of Maine from the 1860s all the way up through the 1950s and 60s. But what do we first see starting in around 1960 is mill jobs being shipped from Maine down first to the US South and eventually to the global South. And why were they doing that? Well, they were trying to avoid their unionized workers, right? And go to the South where they could go to open shops that were not unionized, and eventually escape US labor laws altogether by going to the global South where they could really squeeze labor. Now, that's one example. We could look at the paper mills, we could look at any other industry, and we certainly could look beyond Maine, right? But the point is that when we talk about economic transitions, and the energy transition to address the climate crisis is a huge one, we have a lot of work to do to actually make sure that we have credibility when we go back to our union members and workers anywhere and say, don't worry, it'll be okay. These jobs, they'll be good ones that are coming. And let me just give you a little bit of evidence from right out here in our own solar fields here in our backyard here in Maine, right? There are good union jobs in solar construction and in other forms of renewable energy. And yet, at the same time, we don't have to look far to see plenty of low-road contractors and developers coming to Maine in search of cheap land and trying to get outside of the bubble of Boston, where there's greater union density, and really trying to make as much money as they can, as quick as they can, in part by skimping and really pinching workers. And that, on the one hand, is like something that any of us should care about from that human point of view, from a social and a fairness point of view. And I want to make the case that's like our number one priority. But I want to make the case to you as well that even if all you cared about was addressing the climate crisis as quickly and efficiently and effectively as possible, that this isn't a good way to go, right? And just as a quick side note, I encourage any of you to go onto Glassdoor or Indeed or wherever you look for jobs, put in the term traveling solar panel installer and look at what pops up. What the evidence we see here in Maine and across the country is that the bulk of jobs in the utility scale solar industry are low paying hourly jobs, many of them, in fact, almost most of them, highly temporary positions through third-party labor contractors who move them around from Maine to Wisconsin to Idaho, very little per diem to make sure they can actually live in the place where they are doing the job, no voice on the job, working in unsafe working conditions, right? All of these things are things that, again, I imagine many on this call would care about. But the reason I have this particular picture up here, again, just to bring this back through the lens of the climate crisis, is this is what happens when we don't put workers at the center and we try and make many bucks as quick as we can. What you see here is a failure on the part of a contractor to do due diligence and recognize that there is bedrock mere inches from the surface of the soil here. And so they can't properly mount the solar panel racking, which is, again, essential to actually have these panels stay in place. And so they have big buckets of rocks that are holding these down. And these solar panels effectively are giant sails. When you get a large nor'easter coming through, as we did this March down in Wells, right, we see evidence of panels on this project getting blown aside. A similar issue happened when we had 1,500 panels blow away in a windstorm because they weren't properly bolted down. Sorry, I have a child here at home. Shoddy work is not the fault of workers per se, it's the fault of an industry model that is squeezing labor, not giving them the proper training, not giving them the voice on the job where they could stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not the quality that we know we need to provide. The last reason I want to give for you is that tools for fighting inequality in the workplace work pretty well for advancing other forms of justice to, whether it's racial justice, gender justice and equity, or climate and environmental justice. And I wanted to show you a little bit of data here, national data from the Center for American Progress, which is that union membership empirically across time narrows the racial wealth gap. It narrows the racial income gap even farther, but the racial wealth gap, which is such an intractable, difficult thing to address, we see is closed most greatly through membership in a union. And that's because union contracts create fair and enforceable transparent systems for compensation, right? Essentially equal pay for equal work and equal systems for promotion, hiring, and firing. Again, similar story. Unions are more effective than almost any other tool for narrowing the gender pay gap, right? And we see the pay gap narrowed empirically even further for unionized women of color, and that all unionized women are more likely than their non-union counterparts to have paid family leave. The reason is simple. It's not because unions are some magic unicorn. It's because when workers come together, they have more leverage than if they're on their own. That's it. So if I leave you with nothing else, is that there are like myriad reasons why it is essential for those of us who might think of ourselves as primarily interested in climate or environmental justice or some other form of justice to think about where we can find power, where we can locate and put workers in the middle. And the argument that I've put in front of you, and I think the evidence is pretty clear, is that strength is in numbers. When workers come together, they have leverage. And it is, I think, in all of our interests and behooves all of us to find ways to really strengthen the labor movement and work through the labor movement to address climate change at the speed, scope, and scale that science says we must. I'd love to take any questions. Thank you again for inviting me. Eager to have any discussion afterwards.
Thank you so much, Francis. It is always a surprise to me how much I still have to learn about the role of the labor movement in all of this work. And I'm so grateful to you for being with us today and sharing some history and some present day and future visioning. So I really appreciate it. And I know this afternoon, we're going to share a follow-up email to everybody on this call with a couple of ways to continue that learning together and to make sure that you've got the information that you need to be a strong ally to the labor movement. So that includes things like signing up for the Maine AFL-CIO's weekly newsletter, so you get the latest on Maine labor news and know where and when to show up in solidarity at strikes and union organizing drives. It includes exploring the Maine Labor Climate Council that Francis leads and that is running some really interesting campaigns that we look forward to sharing more information with you about. There'll be links to both of those things. And also just to keep your eyes open for opportunities to fight alongside our labor friends for high road labor standards at every turn. And that comes up a lot in procurement legislation that you're used to hearing about from MCV when it comes to clean energy. So look for all of that later this afternoon. And we've got some great questions already in the hopper. You can keep sending those to me through the chat. And let's just dig in. Francis, I really appreciate you talking a little bit about that false tension. Well, maybe not entirely false, but that overblown tension perhaps between climate and jobs. And I know I've heard some of that just in my travels. When people talk about the recent federal legislation that was so incredible, the Inflation Reduction Act, and some of the electric vehicle provisions that include really important labor standards, but also have some other consequences. Could you say a little bit more about that and just how we should be thinking about those? And we run into people at barbecues this weekend. What do we say when they say, was that on purpose?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there's a number of ways to come at this. I want to just clarify the tension between jobs and the environment, jobs and climate, it's real. And when we have fights over pipelines, that is real. And I do not want to diminish that. I also want to say there are lots of places where there is overlap, and there is places where we can, like, through low-hanging fruit, like, advance things where we don't have that conflict. And so I think, like, at a macro level, one thing I would say is, like, let's start in the labor movement with our friends and allies in the environment and climate movement. Let's start with the things that we all agree on. We all know we got to do deep retrofits on buildings. We know we want to build out our EV charging infrastructure. We know we need to do more solar and wind, all these things, right? We can agree on a lot of that. And I think when we start adding labor standards to make sure that, for all the reasons I said, these are good union jobs that we're creating, that makes all the conversations around really difficult, really contentious projects maybe one ratchet less contentious. I don't want to say they're going away, right? They're not. But, like, when we actually have credibility to show that the jobs that are being created in this new sector are on par with jobs in fossil, that's a different conversation to have. So that's one start. When it comes to the EV standards and the domestic content requirements, look, like, I think this is small potatoes in the grand scheme of where we're going. We're talking about a 20-year project to remake the entire automobile supply chain, right? And I think it's in, as I said, around solar and wind here in Maine, I think it's in everyone's interest to have, like, mining for rare earth metals that go into all of the electrical components for not just cars, but for anything, be done in the most responsible way. And the way to do that, the easiest way to do that, is to have domestic content requirements where we can get this through good permitting processes. We can have, again, the best trained workers on the job to make sure we don't have spills, accidents, the kinds of things that have wide-ranging ecological and social impacts. And so the way I look at it, and I think the way that I see others on this call from the labor community, the way I think they look at it too, is, look, there is no zero impact way to live in a modern society. And so the question is, how do we do this in a way that lifts up workers and doesn't put the climate crisis and addressing the climate crisis on the backs of working people? And I think there would be a lot of agreement for many of you, I imagine, who come out of the environmental or climate community to say the same about, the priorities that you bring, right? Let's have responsible siting of renewable energy infrastructure. Let's not just build it, anywhere on any terms, but, like, let's do this in places where it makes the most sense, right? Like, when we raise the floor, I think we can then talk about where innovation can happen. So, I think it'll take a couple of years, and I'm not an expert on auto supply chains. It'll take a few years to really build up that supply. But at the end of the day, if it means that we have less demand on overseas labor that we know is being done under the most exploitative conditions, I would hope that's something we can all agree about is an important and urgent thing to do. And at the end of the day, this pie is getting bigger much more quickly than I think any of us can really imagine. So, like, yes, will there be some temporary waiting as we build new chip factories in Ohio, which I know the president just helped cut the ribbon for yesterday? Sure. But when we look back in 2050 at how we address the climate crisis, I will be shocked if folks are like, you know what, the Inflation Reduction Act didn't quite move fast enough on the auto piece. I think we'll get there. The last thing I'll say is that EVs are important. They're a huge part of the solution. And I think, especially from a union perspective, there are a lot of really good transit jobs for bus operators, for the mechanics, for all the workers who build tracks, rail systems, roads. And we know, from an efficiency standpoint, the best way to move people around from A to B is through transit systems, right? And so there's, I think, an opportunity, and the Inflation Reduction Act helps bring resources to really start building up our public transit infrastructure. So there's not a single way to go here, and I'm actually feeling really excited by what has been opened up, what possibilities exist because we now have the IRA.
I love that. And it's just so exciting to think about this opportunity to meet the multiple crises that we face with a little bit of forethought at the beginning, right? So instead of saying we just have to do X or Y as quickly as possible and we'll clean up the mess afterwards, saying let's take a pause, let's look at the history and what has worked well for supporting workers and communities and our economy and our environment over time, and let's do that on purpose. that is a really exciting and proactive approach. Wow, thank you. So when we talk about transitioning, I think one of the things that you touched on that's so important is that, yes, there will be losses in union jobs in the fossil fuel industry, but there are also gains in union jobs in the renewable energy industry. That feels really easy from moving imaginary pegs from one category to another. What does it look like on the ground in terms of retraining folks and really making big changes in the kind of work that you've been doing your whole life to a new kind of work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And to be honest, we are just in the last year starting to see state legislatures get serious in Illinois and New York to try and put some meat on the bone of what this looks like. There's a couple of things that come to mind. One is not all workers can or will who are working in a fossil generation plant that is slated for decommissioning. Not all of those workers can or will or should be expected to find jobs in renewable energy. And job number one, I think, for all of us, especially in the labor movement, is to say, before we talk about getting rid of closing down more plants, we need to first make sure that we are raising the standards as high as possible in the renewable energy sector. That's job number one. Job number two is to say, we need to, for every new megawatt of renewable energy that our state or our ISO New England or through federal incentives that we purchase and procure, that we are putting actual resources, requiring developers themselves to bring resources to the table to give wage replacement, benefit replacement, bridge to retirement, guarantees of priority in hiring, to retrain workers. This all needs to happen and needs to be done at the same time as procurements of renewable energy are happening. And we see examples of this happening legislatively, as I mentioned, in Illinois last year and in the state of New York just 2 months ago, where their version of the Public Utilities Commission, because unions were at the table leading the charge, have really strong provisions requiring developers of renewable energy to do all of those things. That to me is a real opportunity. We haven't seen a whole lot of it yet. I think it's going to take building more power and greater alliances between labor and environment, labor and climate to do it. But we need to get serious about it, because it is just I'm looking here at my brother Jason Chedlock here in the building construction trades. We will not be taken seriously by our members who work on pipelines if we say, don't worry, we got it, just trust us, these jobs will be good jobs, we'll find some way to retrain you. We got to actually have the receipts and show it through action, show it through actual projects to make it happen. The last thing I'll say is, I think we can do better than just say, either we're building renewable infrastructure and shutting down fossil infrastructure. There are ways in which I think there are even more novel, less mature energy systems out there that we can and should be exploring. And a couple of examples come to mind. One is in the state of New York, the UA, which is the United Association, Plumbers and Pipe Fitters, and the laborers, I believe, were involved in this too, passed legislation that put real resources incentivizing the construction of district heating and cooling systems, right? These are skills that are squarely in the wheelhouse of these highly trained unionized workers, right? That is a really efficient way to heat and cool buildings in dense, built up, urban environments and suburban environments, right? We can do a whole lot more of that. Second example that comes to mind is, and this is in part incentivized through the IRA, there are good examples in Europe where they have excess wind power that is being put to use to generate hydrogen, which we know we have to do for hard to electrify industries like making cement, for example. And there's many ways to create hydrogen. Let's do it with renewable energy when it's in excess on the grid. And guess what? We can transport that hydrogen through a lot of existing pipeline infrastructure, right? And other, transfer stations, ports, all of that, right? Again, these are highly paid, really highly skilled jobs that I don't think we should lead the conversation by saying, how do we put these people out of work? Not that anyone on this call is saying that, but we can actually get ahead of it and think about how can we, where it makes sense, repurpose existing infrastructure for novel energy systems that we can and should be investing in.
it's just so exciting. And I'm so grateful that you're with us today to sort of pull that curtain back on some of the conversations that that we may not all be aware of and the work that's happening. What do you see as key elements to building those bridges between labor, environmental advocates, folks who have tremendous overlap in goals and strategies and all of those things, but haven't traditionally had the strongest relationships? How do we fix that problem? And maybe it's the Maine Labor Climate Council. So thank you.
I appreciate the nod, and I appreciate all the work that has created Maine Labor Climate Council. We cannot be the only ones doing this work, although I'm excited we exist, and I hope we do more of it. I could talk for hours about ways in which we can and should be doing this, but I'll give a few examples. One is, look, there are unionized teachers, nurses, postal workers, you name it, and other professional workers who work in buildings that, again, we know need to be retrofitted. We can put renewable energy, systems to power them where it's feasible into play. And there are now all kinds of federal resources, whether it's through the American Rescue Plan, which sent a lot of money to schools that has been unspent, or whether it's through the IRA, which now has this direct pay mechanism to make tax-exempt entities like local governments able to receive the incentive, right? This has brought a whole new pool of workers into play to use their collective leverage through bargaining and elsewhere to have their employers submit the application, right? It's almost that simple to bring these resources into our communities. Those workers need support when they're going in front of city council, when they're going to the superintendent or to the school board. And it makes a whole lot of difference when those teachers, those postal workers, whoever, right, are backed up by community members who might be parents of children in a school, right, to say, yes, we want this too, right? This is not coming at the expense of us as taxpayers. We're not pitting workers against tax-paying residents, right? That kind of support goes a long way. There's other ways, legislation is going to come up this next session. We don't know what the balance of power will look like. We don't know what's possible. But the next time we're doing some procurement, right, like bring us in on the ground floor, right? And this needs to go both ways too. This is not just the onus being placed on the climate and environmental community. We in labor need to do the same, right? But like there are a lot of places, and there has been good examples. I'm thinking of 2 years ago, the bill to build affordable housing and put real resources into this using like both energy efficiency standards and strong labor standards. Like we can do more of that. And I know there's going to be like messiness around the table as we get used to what each other's priorities are and language. And there might be, rough areas where we don't agree, right? And it might be awkward, but like those relationships that get developed through actual legislative fights or actual campaigns and actual communities, that's where we're going to start like building a common shared program. It's not through, and I love this talk. I'm glad we're doing this. We need to do more of this. This helps, but like it's through actual shared fights that I think people build trust. And we got to move beyond just talking in theory about what partnership looks like. So I'm excited. Maine is I think leading the way. We've had some great examples of where there's been good alliances in the last few years. I think there's a lot of opportunity going forward to do more of that, again, in legislation, in campaigns, and beyond. So that's a couple of ways. The last thing I'll say is like, sign up for the AFL-CIO's weekly newsletter. I think you mentioned this at the beginning, Kathleen. Like when workers are going on strike down in Scarborough, right, or wherever it is, right, like having folks show up on the picket line who are fellow union members but not in their union, or better yet, community members who heard about it and they're bringing coffee and donuts and standing right there in solidarity, that goes a long way to building the kind of trust that, starts to break down the barriers of, you're the environmental community, we're a labor. And I think that is an essential and ongoing opportunity for folks to really like build real relationships.
And it's so important too. I know I've really appreciated in our conversations, and I'll pile on to your shout out to Jason Shedlock and in my conversations with you, Jason, that just the moments where where we can call each other out, right? And say, let me tell you how that sounds to the folks I work with all day, every day. And is that what you meant? And when you do have those working relationships, you can say, like, what if we say it this way? That's going to feel a little bit better. And I'm grateful for that. And to me, that's really what partnership looks like. So thank you. And I'm curious about, obviously we're talking about organized labor today. There's also this whole category of owner-operated companies. And those are particularly near and dear to our hearts in Maine, right? The mom and pop shops. And also we've seen in the last, bunch of years, this emergence of the B Corp sort of certification to say, hey, I'm a good business. I do things right. I treat my workers right. How did those other models fit into this discussion and into the future that we're imagining together?
Yeah, it's a great question. I see folks from Revision here, and I know that this comes up actually quite a bit in legislative work and in just the day-to-day, like who's doing the work of building new renewable energy systems and beyond. And this is a long and sometimes like thorny conversation, and I'd be happy to have it with anyone. But here's not to duck or dodge what you're asking, Kathleen, which is really important. The question and the North Star that I have in my mind, and I've learned this from mentors, I'm looking at Jason and others who think about this stuff and have for many more years than me, is like a union is not an end. It is a means to an end. And I think we need to think about what are the ends that are most important to advance broadly shared social and economic and climate and environmental values. And why I see unions as such an effective vehicle is because workers acting collectively have this right to sit down every 1, 2, 3, 4 years, whatever they choose, right, through bargaining to come together and actually bargain over not just wages and benefits, though that is important, but also we're talking about the hours they work, when they're expected to show up, scheduling, workplace safety, who is compelled to do certain kinds of tasks that, again, if you're 300 feet up on a wind turbine, I want to make sure that person, if it's unsafe weather conditions, can say no to the foreman, right? That is a really important thing, super practical. It matters to all of us who want to see these things built, right? But that power to say no is only effective if it's backed up by a collective bargaining agreement and by fellow workers who are willing to stand with that or group, that individual or that group of workers and have their back. And so, it's an imperfect mechanism to be sure, but it's an effective one insofar as there are actual rules that govern the process of collective bargaining, and there is actual power that comes from workers coming together and building shared demands. And so, I'm not here to diss employee ownership or mom and pop. That's not what I'm out for. I'm just saying, I think we need to think about this on a spectrum, right? And what are the goals that we're after? What are the most effective ways to ensure that that happens? But again, there are lots of good allies out here, and I'm not here to trash anyone, but I think we need to get really serious and ask, what actually gives workers the most power on the job if we're putting workers at the center? And what is the most effective way to ensure that when they raise their voice, that it's listened to? And from where I sit and the evidence that's out there, I see unions as being the most effective way to do that. But I get, and I think the world is a better place that we have fewer corporations that have total run of the house and more say for workers and other models. But I have my views, and I'm happy to share with any of you more of why that is.
Thank you. Thank you. We've talked a lot about the new opportunities and emerging opportunities in renewable energy. We also at the same time know, right, that even if we reached carbon neutrality today, we still, which, we're getting there, but even when we hit that milestone, there have already been so many greenhouse gases emitted that we're on a trajectory for continued warming and climate change. So part of this collective project that we're engaged in all together has got to be drawing those down and sequestering emissions. So what is the role for unions in carbon sequestration and in potential technological innovations around agriculture and forestry and beyond?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I am not an expert in those particular technologies, but I think what we find is that there is actually, and this is the good news, like high union density in the kinds of trades and in the kinds of like existing fossil infrastructure where you would see sequestration happening. There's a higher overlap between the kinds of skills workers have in those existing legacy industries and in the ones that you're talking about with carbon capture and sequestration. And this is true as well for like mine reclamation work, right? That we know is really important for stopping methane leaks, right? I want highly trained miners who are part of unions who can, again, like have the highest safety record of any worker in that industry doing that mine reclamation work. And so, you know, the story is like, I think there's an opportunity here as we think about these novel CCS, BECCS, you know, technologies to use in some ways the closest overlap to existing skill sets of existing workers. That's the good news. And that we're already working in highly union dense industries. And so the question is, you know, how do we actually get the resources there to deploy that at scale? And again, how do we make sure that like workers through their unions are put at the center of trying to make sure that these roll out in the fairest terms possible?
I love that. And Francis, every time I talk to you, I walk away feeling more optimistic and excited about the work ahead and all of the opportunities. And I'm so glad that we got a chance to have this conversation with a larger group today. Thank you for being with us today. Thanks to all of you for joining us. You know that you will get an email later this afternoon. Encourage you to share the link to the recording of this program and also to follow the links that you'll find in there to sign up for the newsletters and explore the Maine Labor Climate Council and really think about how we can continue building these partnerships and doing this work together. We're going to be off next week, but we will be back in this space on September 23rd for another conversation about the equitable implementation, that just transition that is such an important part of our climate action movement. This time we're going to be focusing on Justice 40, which is the whole of government initiative to ensure that vulnerable communities benefit from federal investments in climate and clean energy. We'll have Lachelle Johnson, who's the State Equity Policy Director at the League of Conservation Voters, with us, and she'll share a little bit about the Justice 40 initiative and how we can be involved here in Maine in making sure that the federal funds that will flow our way, and they will be considerable, make their way to ensure that the most vulnerable communities are benefiting from this transition. I look forward to seeing you all for part 2 of this conversation and really appreciate you all being with us today. Thank you so much, Francis. Have a fabulous weekend, brought to you by the labor movement.
Thank you all.